I want you to picture a scenario that might feel pretty uncomfortably familiar if you pay any attention to modern wellness trends.
Oh, yeah. The whole optimization lifestyle.
Right, exactly. Picture yourself doing everything theoretically right for your physical health.
Yeah.
Like you track your sleep cycles, you wake up before dawn to log your miles on the pavement, you meticulously adjust your macros to heal some long-standing digestive quirks.
You're doing the work.
Yeah. You might even be one of those people who, to take their raw lipid panels and feed them into predictive models to map out your metabolic future.
Right.
You're playing the game of personal health, and by every measurable metric, you are winning. You have this feeling of total, unquestionable sovereignty over your own biology.
Which is honestly an intoxicating illusion. I mean, we've been culturally conditioned to view the human body as this very complicated but ultimately programmable machine.
Yeah, inputs and outputs.
Exactly. You put the right inputs in the broccoli, the zone 2 cardio, the hydration, and you expect this linear, predictable output of good health.
But the reality is that biology has this element of absolute chaos that we just cannot program away.
No, we really can't.
All that sovereignty, all that control, it can simply vanish in the middle of the night. You can be struck down by a sudden, agonizing, totally unpredictable pain. A structural failure so profound, it feels like the internal architecture of your body is just caving in.
Which is a massive psychological trauma on top of the physical one, you know?
Yeah.
When a microscopic vulnerability, like maybe a millimeter-wide weakness in an organ wall that's been quietly forming for decades, when that suddenly gives way, the shock isn't just that you're in pain.
Right.
The shock is the realization that you were never truly in control at all.
And that collision between carefully managed lifestyle and random biological chaos is exactly what we're dissecting today. Welcome to another deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Today, our mission is uniquely granular. We aren't looking at a broad medical study or like a historical overview. We're taking a microscopic, hour-by-hour look at a real-time medical crisis.
Yeah, through a really fascinating stack of personal records from a 63-year-old man named Shinichi Sato.
Right, and the primary sources here are just remarkable because of their immediacy. We have access to his personal diary entries, which were written while the illness was actively unfolding.
Which is huge. We aren't relying on his memory of the event a year later. We're reading his real-time rationalizations.
Exactly. And on top of that, we have his official inpatient treatment plan, the actual hospital roadmap for his care, and multiple days of his unfiltered blood test results.
So we get the objective cellular truth of what was happening beneath his skin.
Yes. So our goal today is to trace the exact chronology of his diagnosis with the condition known as descending colon diverticulitis. We're going to examine the cascade of critical judgments made by his family, the diagnostic obstacle course he faced with various doctors, and the really difficult choices Shinichi had to make himself.
And then we're going to decode that raw blood data to understand the invisible biochemical war that forced him into a hospital bed in the first place.
So let's pull up the timeline and step into Shinichi's reality on the night this all began.
Right. So the first domino falls just 2 nights before he's formally admitted to a hospital ward.
Okay.
According to the diary, Shinichi is simply winding down, getting ready for bed, when he experiences this sudden, dull ache in his flank, the side of his abdomen.
And when you look at his initial reaction, it's such a universally relatable moment of self-deception.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, what does he do? He rationalizes it away.
Yes.
He writes in his notes that he suspects it's just a bit of constipation. He figures his digestion is just temporarily backed up.
Right, he minimizes it.
Yeah, he minimizes a completely novel pain, turns out the light, and just goes to sleep. Why is our immediate instinct always to downplay sudden pain like that?
Well, from an evolutionary and psychological standpoint, our brains are essentially prediction engines. We encounter an unexpected stimulus, and the brain immediately searches its database for the most benign, familiar explanation.
Because the alternative is terrifying.
Exactly. Acknowledging a severe, potentially life-threatening internal failure requires a massive cognitive load, and it triggers an immediate panic response. We don't want to panic, so we choose denial. Plus, abdominal pain is notoriously tricky. Early on, visceral pain, the pain that originates from the organs themselves, is usually really vague and poorly localized.
Because the nerves are different.
Yeah, the nerve fibers in our organs are relatively sparse compared to our skin, so it doesn't feel sharp right away. It just feels like a generalized discomfort, which makes the constipation theory feel entirely plausible to him.
But the internal mechanisms of his body are completely indifferent to his psychological denial. Because at 4 in the morning, the situation bypasses vague discomfort and escalates into a full-blown systemic alarm.
The chills.
Yes. He wakes up experiencing severe chills. He actually has to find and pile on heavy blankets just to stop his body from violently shivering in the middle of the summer.
Those early morning chills represent a really dramatic shift in his physiology. When we think of shivering, we usually associate it with just being in a cold environment.
Right, like being out in the snow.
Exactly. But in a medical context, when you're indoors and suddenly shivering uncontrollably, it means your immune system has detected a significant threat, in this case, an infection, and has effectively hijacked your brain's thermostat.
Wait, walk me through how that actually happens. How does an infection in your abdomen make you feel freezing cold?
It starts right at the site of the infection. Immune cells encounter the bacteria and release these signaling molecules called pyrogens.
Pyrogens, okay.
Yeah. These pyrogens travel through the bloodstream, cross the blood-brain barrier, and reach the hypothalamus, which is what regulates your body temperature.
Right.
Now, normally, your hypothalamus is set around 37 degrees Celsius or 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. But the pyrogens force the hypothalamus to raise that set point. It suddenly decides that your normal temperature should now be, say, 39 degrees Celsius.
Oh, wow. So your brain has cranked the thermostat up, but your physical body is still at its normal temperature.
Precisely. Your body is now, relative to this new set point, hypothermic.
Oh.
Yeah, you feel freezing because your brain is telling you that you are too cold. So to reach that new higher temperature, your body initiates shivering thermogenesis.
Which is the violent shaking.
Right. Your muscles rapidly contract and relax to generate heat, and your peripheral blood vessels constrict to keep that heat trapped in your core. He was shivering because his body was literally trying to build a fire to cook out whatever pathogen was attacking him.
That mechanism is just incredible to visualize.
It really is.
So he finally makes it through the rest of the night, and by 6 in the morning, he wakes up feeling profoundly sluggish. And the pain in his flank hasn't dissipated at all. In fact, it's sharply intensified.
Not a good sign.
No. So he finally reaches for a thermometer, and he logs a fever of 37.7 degrees Celsius. For our listeners using the imperial system, that's just under 100 degrees Fahrenheit. It's not, an alarmingly high number, but it is an undeniable sustained fever.
And it perfectly tracks with the physiological sequence we just talked about. The chills at 4 in the morning were the engine revving up. The fever at 6 in the morning is the result of that engine hitting its target temperature.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the pyrogen successfully reset the thermostat, the shivering generated the heat, and now his core temperature is elevated to fight the infection.
Which brings us to a really crucial juncture in the decision-making process. At 6 in the morning, holding a thermometer that confirms a fever, dealing with escalating pain, Shinichi finally admits he needs medical attention.
Good call.
But, and this is wild, even in this state, his diary notes that he figures he'll just go sometime in the morning.
He's still delaying.
Yes. He is still trying to pace out this crisis on his own terms. But he doesn't get to, because his wife steps in and completely overrides his judgment. She insists, non-negotiably, that he has to go to the clinic the absolute second they open at 9 in the morning.
This is a classic demonstration of why objective observation is so often necessary in a medical crisis. When you are the patient, your perception is heavily clouded.
You just can't see it clearly.
Right. You're exhausted from a night of shivering, your cognitive function is blunted by this systemic inflammation, and you're still clinging to that fading hope that this might just go away on its own. You are the proverbial frog in the boiling water, unable to perceive the lethal shift in your environment because it's happening to you.
It's like a check engine light on a car. The driver, Shinichi, wants to ignore it and just keep driving until it's convenient. But the co-pilot, the wife, sees the smoke pouring out of the hood and forces him to pull over immediately.
Exactly. She is entirely outside the pot, looking at the water bubbling. She is unburdened by the subjective experience of the pain or the psychological denial.
She just sees the facts.
Right. She observes a sudden onset of severe abdominal distress, uncontrollable shivering, and a fever. She aggregates that data instantly and makes an executive decision. It's highly probable that her intervention prevented a catastrophic delay in his treatment.
It really forces you to consider, how many times we rely on an external observer to save us from our own optimism. Like, how often do we try to just sleep off a symptom, waiting for the convenient moment to seek help, while someone else has to grab us by the shoulders and say, no, we are leaving right now?
It's an uncomfortable truth about human autonomy. We are often the least qualified people to assess the severity of our own acute illnesses.
Wow. So, yielding to his wife's insistence, Shinichi prepares to leave for a local clinic at 9 in the morning. But the simple act of leaving the house introduces this terrifying new data point.
Right.
He logs in his diary that he leaves at 8:50 a.m., and the mere action of walking causes agonizing pain to echo through his flank. Like every single footstep sends a mechanical shockwave directly into his abdomen. That is the moment the reality of the situation truly anchors in his mind.
And that transition from a dull resting ache to a sharp mechanical pain upon walking is a massive diagnostic clue.
Really? How so?
It tells us that the inflammation has breached the organ itself and is now affecting the peritoneum.
The peritoneum?
Yeah, that's the highly sensitive membrane that lines the inner wall of the abdomen and covers the organs.
Okay, but why does that specific membrane make walking so painful?
Well, unlike the internal organs, which we mentioned have very few pain receptors, the parietal peritoneum is incredibly rich in somatic nerve fibers. These are the same types of nerves that make a paper cut sting so sharply.
Oh, ouch.
Right. So when an inflamed, swollen piece of the colon rubs against that highly sensitive, inflamed peritoneal lining, it causes excruciating pain. Imagine having a severe blister and then vigorously rubbing a piece of sandpaper against it with every step you take. The bouncy mechanical motion of walking is forcing those inflamed tissues to grind against each other.
That sounds absolutely unbearable. But he manages to reach a local gastroenterologist. Shinichi sits down with Dr. One, still holding on to the hope that this is just a severe case of gastroenteritis, like a bad stomach bug.
Right.
But Dr. One doesn't dismiss it as a bug. They immediately initiate a three-pronged investigative approach: an ultrasound, an x-ray, and a blood test. Let's break down why a local clinic would deploy all three of those specific tools immediately.
It is an incredibly sound, logical progression for ruling out major catastrophes. The blood test is searching for systemic markers like, is there a massive infection or is his liver or kidney function failing?
Okay, that makes sense.
And the x-ray is primarily looking for air. In the abdomen, an x-ray isn't great at showing detailed tissue, but it is excellent at showing if air has escaped the intestines and is floating free in the abdominal cavity.
Oh, like a leak.
Exactly. Free air means a perforated bowel, which is an immediate, drop-everything surgical emergency.
And what about the ultrasound?
The ultrasound uses high-frequency sound waves to look at fluid and organ structure in real time. It can spot an inflamed gallbladder, kidney stones, or fluid pooling where it shouldn't be.
But despite running this comprehensive battery of tests, Dr. One looks at the results and makes a very specific judgment call. They cannot give Shinichi a definitive diagnosis.
Interesting.
Yeah, they tell him they strongly suspect it is diverticulitis, but they explicitly state that a CT scan is absolutely necessary to confirm it. They don't just hand him a prescription for antibiotics and tell him to rest. They write a referral letter for a larger general hospital that has a CT scanner.
And that restraint is the mark of an excellent physician.
Really? Even though they couldn't diagnose him?
Exactly, because of that. Under the pressure of a busy morning clinic, it is very tempting for a doctor to make an educated guess, especially when the symptoms align so well with a specific condition. But Dr. One recognized the physical limitations of their own equipment.
Wait, but why couldn't the ultrasound or the x-ray just show the diverticulitis? If it's a structural pouch on the colon, shouldn't an image catch it?
It comes down to the physics of the imaging. An X-ray measures tissue density based on how much radiation passes through. Soft tissues like the colon wall, surrounding fat, and adjacent organs all have very similar densities.
Oh, so it all just blends together.
Right. An inflamed pouch blends right in with the surrounding tissue on a standard radiograph. Ultrasound, on the other hand, is defeated by gas. Sound waves bounce off the air inside the bowel, creating these massive acoustic shadows that obscure the very walls of the colon you're trying to examine.
So the CT scan is the only way?
Yeah, a computed tomography, or CT scan, uses multiple X-ray measurements taken from different angles to construct a highly detailed three-dimensional cross-section of the body. It allows the radiologist to clearly differentiate the colon wall from the surrounding fat and pinpoint the exact location and severity of the inflammation. Dr. One knew they needed that 3D resolution.
I see. Well, I want to focus on what happens next because it shifts from a medical crisis to a complete infrastructure nightmare.
Oh, boy.
Yeah. Shinichi takes his referral letter, leaves the local clinic, and goes to the large general hospital nearby. But when he arrives, he is told they cannot accept any outpatients that day.
What? Why?
Not because they're out of beds, not because of a mass casualty event, because of a system failure. Their IT network or registration system is completely offline.
Oh, wow. That is a staggering reality check regarding the fragility of modern healthcare.
Isn't it?
You have a patient with an acute worsening internal infection carrying a referral from a doctor, standing in the lobby of a major medical facility. The physical building is there, the doctors are in the rooms, the CT scanner has power, but because the digital bureaucracy has collapsed, the physical doors to treatment are locked.
So Shinichi, whose pain is escalating with every movement, whose body is actively fighting this infection, has to turn around. He has to travel all the way back to Dr. 1 just to get a newly addressed referral letter.
That is brutal.
Then he has to hail a taxi, pay a 2,000 yen fare, and bounce his way to a completely different general hospital further away. And because he is arriving as a walk-in referral, without a predetermined appointment slot at this second hospital, he is forced to sit in the waiting room for 3 hours.
3 hours. We really need to pause and unpack the physiological toll of a 3-hour wait under those conditions. It is not just an inconvenience, it is a profound stressor on a system that is already nearing a breaking point.
I mean, he's sitting in a rigid plastic chair, unable to lie down, while his colon is actively inflamed. And he can't get any pain medication either, right? Because they can't risk masking the symptoms before the CT scan.
Precisely. Giving him an analgesic might hide the specific localized pain they need to verify during the physical exam. But beyond the pain, consider the hormonal cascade occurring while he waits.
The stress hormones.
Yeah. His body is already stressed by the infection, triggering his HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. His adrenal glands are pumping out cortisol and adrenaline in response to the physical trauma and the psychological anxiety of not knowing what's wrong.
And that's bad for the infection.
Well, while acute cortisol can have anti-inflammatory properties, prolonged elevated stress in a waiting room environment diverts energy away from the immune response and exacerbates the overall metabolic fatigue. By the time he is finally called in, his cognitive reserves are going to be severely depleted.
That makes total sense. So after enduring that 3-hour gauntlet, he finally gets the CT scan. He sits down with Dr. 2, and the diagnosis is definitively confirmed. Descending colon diverticulitis.
Okay, let's establish exactly what that means structurally.
Right.
The colon is your large intestine. It frames the abdomen, traveling up the right side, across the top, and descending down the left side to the rectum. As we age, the constant pressure of moving waste, especially if a person has had a history of straining or a low fiber diet, can cause the inner lining of the colon to push through weak spots in the outer muscular wall.
The prompt I was given earlier suggested thinking of it like an old bicycle tire.
Yes, that analogy is perfect if we look at the mechanics of it. Imagine the muscular wall of the colon is the thick rubber tire of a bicycle, and the inner mucosal lining is the thin inner tube.
Okay.
If the outer tire gets a weak spot or a tiny tear, the pressure of the air inside forces the inner tube to bulge out through that dab, creating a little bubble on the outside of the tire.
And that little bubble is a diverticulum.
Correct. Having those bubbles is called diverticulosis, and it's incredibly common and usually asymptomatic. Most people never know they have them.
But in Shinichi's case,
If a piece of hardened waste gets trapped in that tiny bubble, or if the pressure causes a micro tear in the pouch wall, bacteria from inside the colon seep into the wall itself. The bubble becomes infected, severely inflamed, and swollen. That active infection is diverticulitis.
okay, so Dr. 2 delivers this diagnosis, and the communication style here is really worth examining closely. The doctor looks at the scan, looks at an exhausted Shinichi, and says, "This must be quite painful, right? I expect the pain to get a bit worse."
Wow.
I found that fascinating because it subverts what we usually expect from a physician. Usually, you expect comfort. You expect, "Don't worry, we're going to get this fixed. You'll feel better soon."
I wouldn't call it subversion. I would call it strategic clinical empathy.
Strategic empathy.
Yeah. By stating, "This must be quite painful," the doctor isn't just offering sympathy, they're validating Shinichi's subjective reality with objective data. Shinichi has spent the morning wondering if he's overreacting, dealing with the psychological weight of the wait.
Right, the denial from earlier.
Exactly. The doctor looks at the scan and effectively says, "Your pain is justified. I see the damage." That immediately establishes a deep foundation of trust.
But why predict that it will get worse? That seems like it would just induce panic.
Because the doctor is preparing to offer him a very difficult choice, and he needs Shinichi to make that choice based on the reality of the disease's trajectory, not false hope.
attempt to manage expectations.
The doctor knows that the inflammatory cascade has not yet peaked. By warning him that the pain will increase, the doctor prevents Shinichi from panicking later tonight when he feels worse despite starting treatment. It is a brilliant way of managing patient expectations.
That makes a lot of sense, because immediately after validating the pain, Dr. 2 issues an ultimatum. Shinichi can either be formally admitted to the hospital right then and there, or he can attempt to manage the infection as an outpatient, which would require him to go home and commute back to the hospital for his 5E treatments.
Putting that decision on a patient who has just endured a multi-hour ordeal of pain and bureaucratic failure is intense. The allure of your own bed, your own home, is incredibly strong when you're feeling vulnerable.
But Shinichi's reasoning process here is incredibly sharp. He sits in the consultation room and runs a logistical and physical calculation. He notes that the second hospital, the one he had to take a taxi to, is a significant distance from his house.
Right, a 2,000 yen ride.
Exactly. He factors in the agonizing mechanical pain he felt just walking to the first clinic. He factors in Dr. 2's promise that the pain is going to escalate. He realizes that a daily bouncy taxi commute is a physical impossibility.
Smart man.
He chooses hospitalization, writing in his diary. Resultingly, that judgment was correct.
It demonstrates a remarkable level of self-awareness. He managed to override the emotional desire for the comfort of home by logically assessing the mechanical limitations of his own inflamed peritoneum.
Now, before we dive into the raw blood data that proves his judgment was correct, I want to present a theory based on a detail buried in his broader medical diary. I want to see if this connection holds water medically, because if it does, it's wild.
Oh, I'm always open to a theory. What did you find in the mornings?
So we have records from a couple of months prior to this acute crisis. In those earlier entries, Shinichi documents a frustrating struggle with persistent lower back pain. But it wasn't a generalized ache. He specifically describes a deep, hard knot of muscle tension localized entirely on his left side.
Okay.
It was stubborn enough that he was seeing an orthopedic specialist who was administering trigger point injections, using needles to inject local anesthetic directly into the hardened muscle to break the spasm.
I remember reading those entries. Trigger point injections can be quite effective for chronic myofascial pain syndrome.
Right, but here's my question. The descending colon, the exact site of this diverticulitis, is located on the left side of the abdomen, descending down toward the pelvis.
Yes, it is.
His muscle pain was a deep, localized knot on the left side of his lower back. Is it entirely crazy to suggest that this structural issue in his gut, a diverticulum that was perhaps slowly getting irritated or experiencing low-grade microinflammation over months, was masquerading as lower back pain? Like the internal organ was whispering to the surrounding muscles, causing them to cramp up in defense.
Well, it's a compelling narrative, but we have to be careful about confirmation bias here. Lower back pain in a 63-year-old man is extraordinarily common, often just a result of mechanical wear and tear on the lumbar spine or simple postural strain. The fact that local anesthetic injected directly into the muscle provided relief suggests the primary pain generator was indeed the muscle tissue itself.
But couldn't the muscle spasm be a secondary reaction to the organ?
And that is where your theory gains medical traction. We are talking about the phenomenon of referred pain and viscerosomatic convergence.
Viscerosomatic convergence.
Yeah. The nerve pathways that carry sensory information from our internal organs, the viscera, do not have their own dedicated, exclusive highways to the brain. When those visceral nerves reach the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, they synapse or connect onto the exact same secondary neurons that carry sensory information from the skin and muscles of the back and abdomen.
Oh, so the signals get crossed on the way to the brain.
Exactly. The brain receives a pain signal arriving on that shared pathway. Because the brain is vastly more accustomed to processing pain from a pulled muscle than an inflamed colon, it misinterprets the origin of the signal. It projects the feeling of pain onto the muscular region.
That is fascinating.
And furthermore, a chronic, low-grade inflammatory signal from the colon can cause a reflexive, involuntary contraction of the adjacent musculature, like the psoas or the quadratus lumborum muscles in the back. The body is essentially trying to create a muscular splint to guard the vulnerable area. So while we cannot definitively prove it from the text, it is anatomically and physiologically highly plausible that the smoldering fire in his descending colon was causing the smoke alarms to ring in his left lower back muscles.
That interconnectedness is just staggering. It highlights why diagnosing abdominal pain is such a minefield.
It really is.
But eventually the fire got too big to ignore. Shinichi felt his decision to stay in the hospital was correct based on his subjective pain. But we don't have to rely on subjective feelings. We have the objective, undeniable truth of his raw blood test results.
The blood work is where the narrative shifts from symptoms to cellular mechanics. It strips away the guesswork.
I want to spend significant time decoding this data because of the contrast between the two lab reports is fascinating. We have a snapshot from the moment he was admitted on July 7th at 1:03 p.m. and another snapshot from the following morning, July 8th at 6:35 a.m. Let's start with the frontline defenders. The white blood cells, or WBC.
Right. White blood cells, or leukocytes, are the mobile units of your immune system. They constantly patrol the bloodstream, looking for invaders. A normal baseline count usually hovers somewhere between 4,000 and 9,000 cells per microliter of blood, depending on the specific lab's reference range.
Okay, looking at the printout for July 7th, his WBC is listed as 135. Now, the unit attached to that number is 10 to the second power per microliter, which means we have to multiply by 100 to get the standard count. So his actual count at admission is 13,500.
Which is very high.
Yeah, that is well above the normal ceiling. The alarm bells are clearly ringing, and the system is flooded with cells. But then, we look at the lab from the very next morning, less than 24 hours later. The WBC has dropped to 96, which equates to 9,600.
Back to normal.
It is essentially back within the upper limits of a normal range.
Yeah.
If you only looked at that one number, you would assume he was magically cured overnight.
And that is the danger of viewing lab values in isolation. The drop in circulating white blood cells does not mean the infection is gone.
It doesn't.
No. To understand why it dropped, we need to understand how white blood cells move. They don't just float aimlessly, they respond to chemical trails. When the diverticulum became acutely infected, the tissue released chemical distress signals. The body rapidly produced new white blood cells in the bone marrow and dumped them into the bloodstream, causing the massive spike we see on the 7th.
So they were in transit to the battle.
Yes. But once they reach the infected colon, they undergo a process called diapetesis. They actually squeeze through the walls of the blood vessels, exit the circulatory system, and enter the localized tissue to fight the bacteria directly.
Oh, so they leave the blood.
Exactly. Once they leave the bloodstream, they are no longer counted in a standard blood draw. Plus, with the introduction of 5E antibiotics, the systemic bacterial load was likely being suppressed, reducing the demand for new cells. The circulating pool normalized, but the tissue-level battle was still raging.
And we know the battle was raging because of the next marker on the list. CRP, or C-reactive protein. This is a primary marker for inflammation. The normal reference value is anything below 0.3 milligrams per deciliter. On July 7th, at admission, Shinichi's CRP was 4.77.
That is more than 15 times the normal limit.
That level of elevation indicates a severe acute inflammatory event. But here is the paradox that requires an explanation. On the morning of July 8th, while his circulating white blood cells were dropping back to normal, his CRP completely exploded. It more than doubled overnight to 10.55.
A massive jump.
Why is the primary immune measurement dropping while the primary inflammation measurement is doubling?
It is a beautiful example of biochemical logistics and temporal lag. To understand this, we have to look at where these things are manufactured. White blood cells are deployed rapidly from the bone marrow, but C-reactive protein is an acute phase reactant produced almost exclusively by the liver.
Wait, the liver? Why does the liver care about an infected pouch in the colon?
Because the immune system is highly coordinated. When those white blood cells reach the colon and start fighting the bacteria, the combat is messy. Cells are dying, bacteria are being destroyed. The active immune cells on the front lines release specific communication molecules called cytokines, most notably interleukin-6.
Okay, cytokines.
These cytokines act as messengers. They travel away from the colon through the bloodstream until they reach the liver. They bind to receptors on the liver cells and deliver a message. We have massive tissue damage and bacterial invasion occurring. Start manufacturing CRP immediately.
What does the CRP actually do once the liver pumps it out?
It acts as an opsonin. It travels through the blood, finds dead or dying cells in certain bacteria, and binds to their surfaces. By attaching to them, the CRP acts like a glowing biochemical tag that makes it much easier for other immune cells to recognize and consume the cellular debris.
So the lag is just the time it takes for the messenger to reach the factory to build the product, and the product to be shipped back out into the blood.
Exactly. The CRP of 10.55 on the morning of the 8th is not reflecting the current state of the battle at 6:35 a.m. It is a delayed echo of the massive carnage that was occurring the afternoon and evening before.
Wow.
It perfectly confirms Dr. Tu's warning. The doctor knew the inflammatory cascade hadn't peaked yet, and the 10.55 CRP proves the systemic inflammation continued to build long after Shinichi was admitted.
That is incredible. And we can also see the exact nature of the threat by looking at the specific breakdown of those white blood cells, the differential. The data shows his neutrophils were at 79.4% of his total white blood cell count on the 7th and remained incredibly high at 74.0% on the 8th. The normal range is usually between 40 and 60%.
Neutrophils are the undisputed heavy infantry of the immune system when it comes to bacterial threats.
The heavy infantry, I like that.
Yeah, they are phagocytes, meaning they literally engulf bacteria and destroy them using powerful enzymes and reactive oxygen species, essentially microscopic bleach. Oh. The fact that his profile was so heavily skewed toward neutrophils, a phenomenon we call a left shift, is absolute confirmation that this was a severe bacterial infection erupting from the colon wall, not a virus or a simple inflammatory flare-up. The neutrophils were swarming to eat the bacteria, leaking from the diverticulum.
The granularity of this data is just astounding. It tells a complete story. But there is another subtle story hidden in a different set of numbers, and it bridges the gap between his biology and the physical reality of his hospital treatment.
Oh, the proteins.
Yes. I noticed that his total protein dropped from 7.3 to 6.5, and his albumin dropped from 4.4 to 3.8. Both of those numbers fell below the normal reference ranges overnight. How do those protein drops fit into the picture?
They fit perfectly into both the pathophysiology of inflammation and the strict protocols of his medical care. First, the pathophysiology. We mentioned earlier that inflammation causes the blood vessels to become permeable. The cytokines released during the infection cause the endothelial cells, the cells lining the blood vessels, to physically contract and pull apart slightly.
Like stretching a knitted sweater so the holes get bigger.
That's a great visual. They pull apart to allow those white blood cells to slip out of the blood and into the infected tissue. But when those gaps open, fluid and smaller proteins, primarily albumin, leak out of the bloodstream and into the interstitial spaces, the spaces between the cells.
They're just leaking out.
Right. This capillary leak syndrome causes the concentration of albumin in the blood test to drop.
But there is a secondary reason, isn't there? One directly tied to the primary treatment method for this disease.
Yes. His body is burning massive amounts of energy to fight a fever and fuel an immune response, and he has completely stopped taking in new proteins.
Because he's not eating. Which brings us perfectly to the official inpatient treatment plan. This document outlines the exact reality of his daily existence in the hospital. The details note he's placed in a 4th floor ward, room 422. His attending physician is Dr. Chiaki Shimizu. The expected duration of his stay is listed as approximately 1 week. But the medical strategy itself is fascinatingly blunt. The core treatment is listed as just 2 things: fasting and 4V drips. The stated goal is absolute bowel rest.
It sounds archaic in an era of advanced medicine, but turning off the digestive system is the most critical intervention for diverticulitis.
Really? Just not eating?
Yes. The colon is not just a passive storage tube. It is a highly active muscular organ. Every time you swallow food, it triggers a cascade of neural and hormonal signals that initiate peristalsis, the coordinated rhythmic muscular contractions that propel waste through the intestines.
And if you have a highly inflamed, structurally compromised pouch on the wall of that intestine.
Exactly. Any mechanical squeezing, any passage of physical matter is going to act like a battering ram against that weakened pouch. It will prevent the micro tears from healing, it will exacerbate the inflammation, and it dramatically increases the risk of a full-blown perforation, which would spill fecal matter into the sterile abdominal cavity.
Which is life-threatening.
Very. The only way to prevent the colon from contracting is to completely starve the gastrointestinal tract of any stimulus. No food, no digestion, just intravenous fluids, electrolytes, and antibiotics delivered straight into the veins.
The nursing plan attached to the document is very holistic, though. It focuses on minimizing his physical suffering, remaining vigilant for any signs of complications, and eventually educating him on how to prevent this from happening again.
That's good standard care.
But while the medical staff is focused on his physical recovery, Shinichi's diary reveals the profound, unexpected psychological toll of this specific treatment.
The psychology of fasting in a hospital setting is a deeply under-discussed aspect of patient care.
Shinichi writes about his current state in room 422. He notes that because his neighbor was discharged, he is alone in a 2-person room. And he makes this brilliant observation about the nature of hunger. He realizes that because he is hooked up to the IV drip, he actually isn't experiencing the physical gnawing of starvation.
Right, his blood sugar is stable.
Exactly. His body is receiving the baseline hydration and glucose it needs to function. But the total absence of the physical ritual of eating has caused his perception of time to completely warp. He writes that time moves agonizingly slow.
It highlights a fundamental truth about human biology. We are rhythmic creatures governed by circadian rhythms. While light is the primary synchronizer of our master biological clock in the brain, food intake is the primary synchronizer of our peripheral clocks. The clocks in our liver, our gut, our muscle tissues.
Peripheral clocks, I didn't even know we had them.
Oh, yeah. We call it a food entrainable oscillator. When you completely remove food, you don't just lose calories, you lose the biological metronome that dictates the pace of the day.
He writes that removing the act of eating makes everything feel incredibly monotonous. Like, we structure our days around these anchors. We wake up, we have breakfast, we work, we pause for lunch, we wind down with dinner. Without those anchor points, a Tuesday in a hospital room is just an endless, featureless expanse of hours.
We view food through the lens of biochemistry macronutrients, fuel for the machine. But Shinichi's isolation reveals that the physical act of chewing, tasting, and the psychological anticipation of a meal are fundamental to our sanity.
They really are.
When you take that away and replace it with the silent, slow drip of an IV bag, the brain is starved of sensory and chronological input.
And he is struck by such a wave of empathy during this realization. He writes about people who suffer from chronic illnesses that require long-term intravenous nutrition, total parenteral nutrition. He says, I can't imagine how tough that must be, having the joy of eating completely removed from your life.
It's a profound thought.
It is a heavy, creeping psychological fatigue that the medical chart simply doesn't capture. Like, the chart checks a box saying his cognitive motivation is no problem, but his diary tells a story of profound endurance.
It serves as a reminder that healing a structural defect in the colon is only half the battle. Surviving the psychological sensory deprivation of the hospital environment requires immense fortitude.
And as we look at the totality of his experience, I have to point out the brutal irony of this entire situation.
What's that?
If we zoom out and look at the broader context of Shinichi's life leading up to this moment, he was the poster child for proactive health management. He had started a rigorous routine of morning runs in January. He had aggressively overhauled his diet to address previous digestive complaints and hemorrhoids. He had successfully driven his triglyceride levels down. He was doing everything the modern wellness industry tells you to do.
He was maximizing his programmable inputs. He was a model patient in terms of lifestyle intervention.
And yet, a microscopic pouch that had likely been sitting quietly on his descending colon for years simply decided to become inflamed. It completely derailed him despite his optimal habits. It proves that while we can build resilience, we cannot eliminate vulnerability.
That is the paradox of human health. Lifestyle changes are incredibly powerful. Shinichi's cardiovascular fitness and improved metabolic health undoubtedly made his body more capable of surviving the acute stress of this systemic infection.
Oh, absolutely.
A weaker cardiovascular system might have buckled under the strain of that 13,500 white blood cell response and the fever. He built a remarkably strong ship, but even the strongest ships have to navigate unpredictable storms, and sometimes a piece of the hull just fails.
So where does this leave Shinichi at the end of the documented timeline? He summarizes his status with a perfect blend of subjective reality and objective hope. He writes, "The pain still remains, but numerically speaking, I am heading toward recovery."
That sentence perfectly encapsulates the lag between the cellular victory and the conscious experience of it. The structural inflammation in the colon takes time to physically reduce, meaning the somatic nerves in the peritoneum are still irritated. He still hurts.
Right.
But the data, the normalizing white blood cells, the plateauing of the acute phase reactants, tells him that the microscopic war has turned in his favor.
It has been an absolute privilege to unpack this timeline. We've traced a journey from a vague, easily dismissed ache at bedtime, through the chilling mechanics of a fever, past the sheer infrastructural failures of a locked hospital system, deep into the biochemical pathways of his liver and bone marrow, and finally into the quiet, time-distorting isolation of room 422.
It is a profound case study in the limits of our own perception, the critical importance of objective data, and the intricate, terrifying, and ultimately resilient mechanisms of the human body.
I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to explore the next time you sit down at a table. Think about your next meal. In our hyper-optimized culture, we have been trained to view eating purely as a transaction, We view it as fuel for the machine, or as a source of fleeting dopamine, or perhaps even as a source of dietary guilt.
Too often, yeah.
But Shinichi's quiet, fasting endurance in that hospital bed reveals a much deeper truth about our relationship with food. Eating is the primary metronome of our conscious existence. When you take the physical act of eating away, time loses its shape. It stretches out into a monotonous void.
It really does.
Ask yourself, how much of your daily psychological momentum, your sense of purpose and progression through the hours, is tied not to the nutritional value of what you consume, but to the simple, ancient, rhythmic ritual of sitting down to eat? The next time you take a bite, don't just calculate the macros, appreciate the rhythm it provides to your life, appreciate your structural health. And as always, thank you for joining.